Welcome. Thank you for attending our first program in 2021. My name is David Brown. I'm the Artistic Director of the 4th edition of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, The Available City. Tonight's program continues to build upon CAB's newly launched model of free year-round programming. The program connects directly to the ideas of the Available City as it highlights ways that designers, artists, community organizations, and residents can work together to develop strategies for building equitable and stable futures. Our moderator for tonight's talk is Iker Hill. Iker is an architect and director of Moss Studio, as well as the founder and editor-in-chief of the design journal Moss Context. In addition, he teaches at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and is the executive director of the SOM Foundation. Iker was the associate curator of the U.S. Pavilion at the 16th Venice Architecture Biennale, and has curated exhibitions at the Chicago Architecture Biennial, the Graham Foundation, and the Art Institute of Chicago. In addition, just as an aside, I've known Iker, I think since he came back to Chicago to study for a Master of Science at UIC, and I think that was maybe in my second year of teaching. And then he invited me to participate in the first Chicago Architecture Biennial as part of his exhibition Volt. And that's where the Available City was first exhibited here in Chicago. Just a few last quick notes before I turn it over to Iker. Please use the chat function throughout the program to share any thoughts and to pose questions for the speakers. And be sure to look out for upcoming programs with photographer Akinbode in February and with the Danish Arts Foundation in March. Thank you again for being here, and I'll now introduce you to Iker Hill.
Thanks so much, David. Yes, it was the first year that I was in Chicago in 2005, so I think that was last year. So thanks, David. Thanks to the Chicago Architecture Biennial for inviting me to be part of this program. I'm super excited to be leading this conversation with David Schalliol and Elizabeth Timme on devising long-term initiatives to shape equitable futures. I'm also excited to discuss some of the ideas and goals behind bold alternative scenarios for Chicago, the exhibition that I curated in the 2015 edition of the Chicago Architecture Biennial, and that included the project, as David mentioned, The Available City, as well as David Schalliol's work. So to start, I'd like to share a few images of the exhibition to highlight the conceptual framework that can be useful for today's conversation. So I'm just gonna go ahead and share that. Sorry, now I'm just like, I'm missing my notes here. Anyway, I'm just gonna go through here. So the 18 projects that were part of BOLT, along with a series of related events, presented an excellent opportunity to engage in public debates about the issues we face, the possibilities they present, and the challenges we need to overcome to make them happen. The projects were a record of a moment in time of each practice, their thoughts about urban issues, as well as the city of Chicago. I'm just gonna do that. The teams explored different aspects of Chicago, both in terms of scale, time frame, and topic of research. And as a curator, I wanted the exhibition to be a first step in a larger and ongoing conversation to continue to build from this effort. Here is how the exhibition was organized. An area for current scenarios to understand the present of the city with photography by David Schalliol and maps by Michael Pesirno. 7 projects organized around multiple topics and scales located on the walls of the gallery. And 9 projects by 9 different offices that were commissioned as a response to David Brown's The Available City project. So I just want to concentrate on 5 key ideas about the exhibition that I think are going to be useful. One, like the first one, is to understand that the exhibition is an important moment in a larger trajectory of projects. So The Available City is a great example of this. Initially, it was exhibited in 2012 as part of an exhibition curated by Alexander Eisensmith that evolved in 2015 to include the 9 individual responses that were included in the exhibition. And this year is the Available the available city is the focus of the biennial. So we can begin to see this larger trajectory of the project as like in each moment, in its iteration of different exhibitions, the project evolves and it has different outcomes. 2, bring participants from different backgrounds, connecting photography, sociology, and cartography with architecture, landscape architecture, urbanism, and design. 3, include participants from different generations and areas of interest to exchange and challenge ideas. 4, establish collaborations between emerging and more established offices to build upon shared interests while learning from each other explorations, and in a way to just build relationships that could be further explored in other projects for the city. So how do we use exhibitions to bring people together that otherwise might not have the opportunity to do so, and create those frameworks, strong frameworks to tackle future projects. And the 5th point that I want to highlight is use projects as a starting point to engage with other offices, as it was the case with the Available City, where David's work really generated the opportunity to engage these 9 offices, their responses as a way of exploring their ongoing work and begin to take David's work into different ideas. So I'm gonna stop sharing. So today I'm excited to welcome David Schalliol and Elizabeth Timme to discuss their work as it relates to long-term initiatives. David Schalliol is a Minneapolis-based sociologist and photographer interested in the relationship between community, social structure, and place. His project, Reckoning with Vacancy, concentrated on Chicago's south and west sides, where the last several decades have brought major changes to the built environment and its communities. His documentary film, The Area, has its premiere broadcast tonight as part of America Reframe or World Channel, so congratulations, David. Architect Elizabeth Timme is the co-founder of LA Mass, a Los Angeles-based urban design nonprofit organization. LA Mass approaches community development by bringing together local knowledge and culture with the power of informal and formal systems. Elizabeth co-founded LA Mass because she saw the potential of design as a collaborative, multidisciplinary approach to public projects and civic planning, a tool that could be used to support and voice the needs of the community. So thanks to both for being able to participate in today's program. We'll start with a presentation by David, followed by a presentation by Elizabeth. And we'll have a time for Q&A afterwards. So send your questions, as David said, through the chat, and we'll bring it up after the presentation. So David, it's all yours.
All right, great. Thank you. Let me set up for my presentation. One moment here. I'll share the screen. Okay, so you should be seeing it now. So, good evening, everyone. So my name is David Schalliol. So I'm associate professor of sociology at St. Olaf College. And I'm really excited to be here talking with you about demolition, about vacancy, about recreation, and to do that in the context of BOLD. And so I'm particularly excited to have this opportunity to talk about the evening's conversation within the BOLD exhibition, in part because of, one of my favorite things is that back in 2015, Eager created this space where my work about vacancy could be in dialogue with David Brown's work about the available city. And so in that project, I focused on demolition and vacancy in Chicago. And the dereliction and vacancy that it produces and to which it is a response, as well as presented some small scale reactions to vacancy and dereliction in context. So looking at everyone from Milton Meisenberg's sculptural transformation of a vacant lot into the Oakland Museum of Contemporary Art in the South Side of Chicago, to how people are making use of what was not yet the Bloomingdale Trail, like in this Halloween birthday party. But so today I'm going to focus on 3 different clusters of projects that show the roots of the work that were shared in that exhibition, and then trace the trajectory of nearly 2 decades of my scholarship from vacancy and dereliction to community-based redevelopment. I'm especially thankful that we can be having this conversation on the eve of the inauguration of President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris, because I really think this new administration affords the opportunity to redefine the way that urban development is done if we start from community-led projects. So as a sociologist, my interest is in the relationship between people, social structure, and place. And I hope it's clear from the introduction and from these early images that I approach that visually. And so I'm interested in analyzing, representing community change and structural forces. So these are things like those that reproduce racial and class-based power through major transformations of the built environment, with an emphasis on repetition, on pattern, on contrast, on commonality. And the first of the kinds of projects I'm going to talk about today are those that operate on the scale of the city. And so I'm interested in thinking about distributed demolition here. And so when I first started working as a graduate student in Chicago in 2002, one of the primary issues, as it is today, was demolition. And so some of those issues were high profile. So these are things like the plan for transformation, which ultimately led to the demolition of nearly all of the city's high-rise public housing and their partial replacement with mixed income housing. And although it's 20 years later, residents are still waiting for some of that replacing, and thousands of units of affordable housing were lost in the process. As a side note, this work was included in the 2017 Biennial with the For the Love of the World exhibition shown here. So happy to have had the opportunity to bring that work into a broader dialogue in that previous version. But demolition of the city isn't just about these monumental scale projects. And these small scale demolitions that happen throughout the city have at least profound consequences. And so it's a huge part of David Brown's Available City. And so we're thinking about the demolition of so many of the city's small scale buildings and the emergence of vacancy and dereliction, particularly in low income communities and communities of color. And so being the good graduate student I wanted to be in the early 2000s, I started to work on projects that were really about that issue. And some of those projects were relatively abstract. And so like the Isolated Building Studies series, it's a typological project I started in 2006 and at least sporadically continue working on today. And that series visualizes the radical transformation of Chicago through a typical project, through a typological project that uses uniform composition of photographs of these buildings flanked by sites where the neighboring structures used to stand. And so, with these remaining buildings, demonstrating so much about property relations and structural disadvantage based in racism and other forms of marginalization, as well as of resilience. And so as a series, we can see how all of that upheaval has been written into the city. So it's just a small sampling of the more than, I think, 700 photographs that are part of the series at this point. So other projects are more complete. So these are like my To Be Demolished project, which is supported by the Driehaus Foundation. And this work, which was published by Gapers Block throughout 2012, tracked more than 100 buildings that were issued demolition permits throughout the city. And so one of the things that became clear in real time while working on this project was that how demolitions of the north side, like these buildings here, was really about investing in communities. Well, the demolition of buildings like these on the south and the west sides were typically because of divestment. And so perhaps the most effective way to show the direct consequences of that difference is to think about this slide. And so in 2016, 4 years after starting the project, I went back to photograph about 20 of these sites, thanks to support from the Hyde Park Arts Center and Darcy Anderson. And so, what did it look like? So here are 10 of the pairs from 2012 to 2016. The addresses should make this clear, but on the left is the south side, on the right is the north side. And so when the buildings were demolished on the north side, they were typically for more construction. On the south side, it typically meant the creation of a derelict lot. And so this series then becomes a launching point for the discussion about policy related to the structural forces that reproduce privilege in well-to-do, wider parts of the city, and reproduce disadvantage in poorer communities and communities of color. And so I'll be completely updating this project in 2022 on the 10th anniversary of the first making of the work. The second kind of project I'll reference today highlights some of those same forces, but through a concentrated look at a neighborhood. So in the Bold exhibition, I also showed this photograph. So it was from a project that I started while working about demolition projects that would ultimately become the documentary film, The Area, about a group of Southside Black residents who are fighting for their community and fighting for respect, while a city-backed project by a freight transportation company really eyed their corner of the city for the expansion of a freight yard. And so it was more than just the gradual demolition of the city through a building here and a building there. It's the swift and literal erasure of a neighborhood. So the project started as part of To Be Demolished. In early 2012, this building on 56th Street was demolished on the same day as 2 other buildings within eyesight. And so knowing how unusual that was, I started looking through my records and found other buildings in the area that were being demolished, including this building that was included in the Chicago Historic Resources Survey, that was demolished by a corporation that ultimately was linked to the train company back in 2009, well before the announcement of the freight yard expansion was made in late 2011. And these photographs are the isolated building studies from even earlier. And so at that point, I started pulling together more demolition permits, reading the scant media attention that was about this freight yard expansion project, and reaching out to neighborhood organizations, to residents, to aldermen, to church leaders, to try to get a sense of what was going on. It's hard to imagine now, but there was so much confusion about the plans, in part because at the time, the recent development proposals for the Olympic Games that ultimately never came to Chicago, but muddled the understanding of what was happening throughout the city, particularly on the South Side. And so it was so clear, what was so clear and unclear about what was happening in this really vibrant community was that, it was just so clear. And one of the potential elements of this was that it was so different from the others, because it's not just some citywide survey of a program, but really, or some sort of problem, but as community study. And so with that in mind, it couldn't simply be that outsider perspective, particularly with a white guy with a connection to the University of Chicago, which is an institution with really a tortured history with the South Side of the city. And so from the beginning, I spent time in the community with residents to see if there was even interest in a project about the issue. And ultimately, it was a collaboration with residents like co-producer and neighborhood activist Deborah Payne, whose message the film is really about. And so the film spans more than 5 years of expansion, displacement, and the resettlement process, focusing on community change, both physical and social, as the neighborhood's connections move from in-person to keeping in touch in other ways. And so it's particularly focusing on the residents' fight. And so despite the unrelenting and sadly, ultimately sort of successful expansion of the rail yard, one of Deborah's lessons that's highlighted by the film is about community engagement, about building relationships with neighbors and others to resist the forces that were literally tearing apart the neighborhood and other neighborhoods, and providing a broad-based community support when things do go awry. And so in the process, we hope that the film reveals some of the mechanisms through which structural racism and other forms of power operate, but also reveals the potential and promise of community action. And so, as we heard, I'm really pleased to say that the film is having its television premiere tonight on America Reframed through PBS's World Channel and online. It's an hour-long version of the film that's different from the theatrical version that really focuses on residents and how they fight. I hope you get a chance to see it. So this brings us to the final category of projects for the evening, and another project that's solution-focused, that's really focused on rebuilding through community-based interventions. And so back in 2009, in the midst of the last recession, historian Michael Carrier and I started working on a research project about do-it-yourself attempts to address the problems that community members see in their neighborhoods. And so it was the work that he and I were already doing with groups in both Milwaukee and Chicago. And we saw in so many places, we saw this going on in so many places around us. And so our collaboration would ultimately become the City Creative, which will be published next month by the University of Chicago Press. This decade-long study utilized our own participation, archival research, documentary photography, interviews, and site visits to visit more than 200 DIY attempts to address the local social problems in more than 40 US cities. We combined these case studies, some of which we followed for over a decade, with the intellectual history of the mainstream top-down creative placemaking movement, which really emphasizes redeveloping places so they can become sites of social interaction and social inspiration. But then we charted an alternative to mainstream placemaking, which emphasizes what is gained by reorienting economic development policy towards community-based groups who connect through redistributive and productive enterprises. And so further linking this work to the Project for Bold, one major thread is that many of these projects are community-driven reuses of derelict sites and others that were really destined for demolition. And so here are a few, including Candy Chang's now famous original Before I Die installation in New Orleans. I'm going to share several more of those groups in the next few slides. So included are projects like the really famous Project Row Houses in Houston, which foregrounds the arts, but uses housing destined to be demolished as gallery spaces and affordable housing. Or Chicago, where the Sweetwater Foundation, which was featured in the last biennial, is transforming the once empty site of Chicago Public School into a garden, education program, job training skills site, while at the same time providing low-cost food to neighborhood residents. to other organizations that are less known. So like Assembly House 150 in Buffalo, New York, which provides former skilled trades development in partnership with an official county jobs program, while building everything from art installations to affordable housing, and the job training program work is all paid labor. And so one of the great things about this being a long-term project is that we're able to see the challenges and opportunities that affect the survival, expansion, or perhaps collapse of projects like this one. I mean, in this case, thinking about expansion quite literally, seeing the same shot from 14, 16, and 19. And of course, there are all sorts of other kinds of types, like the Cusiana Cafe in Chicago, Illinois, the vineyards of Chateau Hoop, which is a winery that's built on formerly vacant lot in Cleveland, to the way that organizations like the sadly now defunct Sprout Fund linked major funders with small-time community groups in order to produce renovation projects like this one, to organizations like Sharon and Larry Adams' Walnut Way in Milwaukee, which combines block cleanup activities seen here, job training, food access, small business development, education, and more in their Lindsay Heights neighborhood, or Big Car in Indianapolis, Indiana, which in addition to doing cultural programming, when they decided they were going to establish a new place, they worked with a not-for-profit community development partner to actually acquire about a dozen buildings in the area in order to retain affordable housing, mitigate any potential gentrifying effect of their presence, and are planning to build many more affordable housing as part of the complex. And so centering all of these projects in the development discourse, we really see as being essential for producing more equitable futures. And so each of these projects actually produces something, and it produces something in this sort of redistributive way. So it produces food, jobs, arts, education, while all being a community-driven catalyst for bringing more resources into underserved communities, and largely doing it in previously derelict and underused sites. And this is also, most importantly, I think, really work that's being done by by groups that have been marginalized by structural forces. So this is so much more than what we think of as traditional placemaking. So it's not to say that there's not a role for more traditional placemaking like mural making, but it's when they try to do something more. And so we can think about this conflict resolution mural in Philadelphia, which transformed these party walls that were exposed by demolition and vacancy and sort of reworked through a social service experiment, bringing together people who are currently incarcerated with people who are survivors of crimes to attempt to try to make a collaborative mural, or early work by Living Walls in Atlanta, Georgia, which stoked political conversations about contemporary issues while linking domestic and international artists through that mural work. And so as we think about demolition and vacancy and how Bold touched on the problems and the promise like therein, I'm really continuing to look to the future. And as I wrap up, of course, that means looking at international models and similar issues outside the United States. Here we can think about locally different efforts to address deindustrialization and the environmental consequences of the collapse of coal production in places like France and Belgium, the development of places like the Metaphone project outside of Lens, France, or community-led projects with regional backing like the Vector in Charleroi, Belgium. We're thinking about the Tohoku region of Japan, which continues to rebuild from the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and radioactive disaster in places like Ishinomaki, which is rebuilding through low-cost small business incubation and sites that are also the creation of new town centers like Hashidori Common and Ishinomaki Labs community-driven furniture program, which really grew out of a necessity to literally rebuild after the disaster. And so I share all these projects with hope, and it's essential that we continue to work to understand how to attack structural forces that reproduce vacancy, dereliction, and dispossession by, for example, addressing contemporary redlining, corporate overreach, and in the process, actively supporting innovative, community-driven solutions that can guide policymakers to what's next, especially as we think about what's next at this really important inflection point of political change. And so with that, thank you, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about L.A. Moss's work. Thanks.
Thank you, David. That was, I feel like we all got a hour-long presentation from you in 15 minutes. That was incredibly impressive. So I will try to match your tenor. And it was very serendipitous that you went ahead of me, because my organization, LA Moss, began as an urban design nonprofit. And really, in much the way you critique and talk about mainstream placemaking, we were operating as a mainstream placemaking group under the guise of building government capacity. And so we were founded, I'm the founder and co-ED of the organization. We were founded in 2013. And we kind of centered design as the primary goal of our organization. And after about 5 years of operating, we shifted to being a place-based community driven organization, and we updated our mission this past summer to reflect our deeper focus on the place of Northeast Los Angeles and our commitment to communities, working class communities of color. And so now our new mission is that we design and build initiatives that promote neighborhood resilience and elevate the agency of working class communities of color. And this is a really important point to talk about, and which I'm going to walk through, our shift from building government capacity to supporting community-based models of resiliency, because often we talk about capacity building communities, or we apply for grants relative to capacity building, or what is our capacity, and kind of denigrate the inherent values which you talk about really well that are more a part of alternative placemaking, or something we've been calling placekeeping efforts around integrating local economic models of resilience. So normally, and I would be remiss not, especially since we're talking outside of Los Angeles in some ways, to kind of ground our previous 5 years and the work that we continue to do as being restorative from a period of kind of immense instability in Los Angeles from 1935 to 1950. Where there was a great deal of social and environmental turmoil in the city, which led to a lot of city planners to kind of institute policies which were heavily racist and destructive to our built environment. And also these kind of national efforts to undermine the ability for communities of color to continue to invest in their neighborhoods with the kind of Redlining Act in 1935. But also the series of floods we had along the LA River in 1938, which led to the concreting of the LA River, which was in many ways like a freeway that ran through a great deal of communities of color. Or in 1943, the kind of red wave that took place nationally, and where a number of Chicanos were beaten by servicemen and police with the Zoot Suit riots. Or 1949, the displacement of over 2,000 individuals at Chavez Ravine over the promise of a Neutra social housing project, which never got built, and instead Dodger Stadium was built on that site. So it is in 1946 to 1961 that Los Angeles institutes our first zoning plan. And so with that, we kind of prioritized a series of measures which were kind of anti-community and really destructive in ways that were kind of are playing out throughout the city and in many cities like Los Angeles. We catered to a very narrow part of the white privileged population to kind of celebrate and honor and keep that part of the population safe at the detriment of every other population of the city. And we went from being a city where we had a really high level of ownership, particularly among African Americans and public transit, to a city that now today has over 500,000 single family homes. Also, because of all these setbacks and car-oriented planning, we have 7,500 miles of sidewalk. And we also have a great deal of bureaucracy that really polices everyone's ability to take advantage of the public right of way. And we have all of these agencies kind of overlapping and dictating what can be done. And in many ways, we say that, or it has been said, that bureaucracy is the laziest form of oppression. And so in Los Angeles, it's alive and well, even today, in much of everything that we try to build or do. And so in 2013, when we began, it seemed quite smart to be this policy and design organization with impact, kind of assumed impact at its center. And we really looked at these 3 sites as alternative sites for community development. And I would say we don't tend to say redevelopment, we tend to say development. That being said, in Los Angeles, it's a very different landscape where we have a kind of continuing growing of the city, and we have an inability to house everyone who is living in our city perimeter. And so these 3 areas of work were where we were focused for the last 5 years, which is alternative housing in the form of creating Section 8 housing as backyard homes, or storefront projects that became a little bit deeper, or public realm projects where we did a great deal of building government's capacity to allow for things that could support riders, public transit users, and first and last mile transit. And all of this was kind of at the behest of thinking about what does neighborhood scale community development look like? However, and what I'm about to take you through relative to our storefront work is all of this was really predicated on the partnerships that we had with government officials, bureaucrats, and policymakers. And so we were in a very real sense, proxies for investment in communities throughout Los Angeles. And something that I think is very unclear if you don't live in LA is that LA is a city, but it's also really a region. LA City County, where we're having kind of a huge number of COVID cases relative to the pandemic, and as an epicenter for the pandemic. It's because LA County is 88 cities, and Los Angeles City is one of them. And so we're really a region. And so LA Moss and my organization, we were working at this regional scale for 5 years, and we really weren't community-based, although the design interventions and these 3 areas of work would make it seem otherwise. And so in many ways, we're building the government's capacity to be able to do community-based interventions, but it wasn't coming from a community identified need. And to really hone in and talk about specifically one of these 3 areas, and since it's only a 15-minute talk, I'm only going to talk about one of these 3 areas, and then I'm going to talk about how we've pivoted towards being place-based and how that's different. But specifically to talk about, as a designer and an organization, how in that pretext, in the kind of traditional pretext of placemaking, we were able to engage with communities and what those kind of strategies were. The very essential transactional act of giving design in a kind of free manner was how we kind of went across the kind of city and the county of Los Angeles. And from 2013 to 2020, we supported small businesses, small business development in low to moderate income communities, initially with free design, but then with permitting, construction administration, and over time, this work kind of became deeper, and we sought to support small businesses at a deeper level. And it became clear that the majority of the work that really needed to be done with small businesses, and this is a member of our team, Rosalinda, was helping someone with a business plan, helping someone with inventory, helping with someone with kind of really basic small business services. And so in this kind of top-down fashion to which we had existed, it became quite obvious that design was really in many ways like the first tool for engagement and to unpack values and to kind of identify areas to increase support or to capacity build, so to speak. And as a designer, it was a really effective way to unpack and tease out kind of deeper values of the business owner, but also of the kind of built environment. And we found that in many cases, what was needed was kind of resources that these businesses weren't registering as being able to be formal enough for the city to offer. So we started in creating a small business support. We operated as a small business support center for businesses that were under $100,000. And we were going from different council district to offer these kind of storefront improvements and these deeper services. And we identified that the city of LA had this really robust business source center that was getting very healthy amounts of funding to support small businesses, but you had to go to that business source center. And there were a kind of slew of issues that existed with these informal businesses that weren't registering to the city of Los Angeles because they weren't happening if you had a formal lease and you were operating at a place where you could take a $100,000 loan. So we put together this commercial lease basics in partnership with local CBOs across Los Angeles and distributed that. But we also successfully lobbied for the mayor's office to really change how they thought of their initiatives and how they were investing locally. And so after doing 3 projects in partnership with the mayor's office on something that was called the Great Streets Corridor, which was an initiative in the mayor's office, we lobbied for our contract and future contracts to include aspects of the small business support for businesses falling under the set criteria and considered informal. And the mayor launched a new outreach method of going door to door, which it's crazy, but that's not how they were engaging small businesses before. And you can really imagine that small businesses that are considered informal or small businesses that don't have a reserve or a rainy day fund, they can't leave their storefront. They are working 12 to 14 hours and they are like, they're not, there is no safety net for them. And we also were really excited when the mayor released $2.3 million in funding on these corridors and a new loan program. So, you know, for us, the program began as this facade improvement, but it really shifted into the kind of training and information and the deeper work that's often kind of invisible. So it went from something highly visible and concrete to highly invisible. And then it kind of longer term, the outcome was that we built the government's capacity to recognize like a whole kind of subset and population that needed to be recognized and supported and needed infrastructure to support them at this kind of government capacity. But I would say that the kind of after, I think we maybe did 15 brick and mortar and over 24 storefronts in this 5-year period of time. The real challenge is that when you build the government's capacity, that's kind of short-term duration. And so in hindsight, we kind of decided to start shifting to being place-based. We couldn't have long-term relationships with these business owners. And when the coronavirus began locally in 2020 and the safer or at-home orders went into effect, we pivoted our entire operational model to, we're not doing any projects outside of Northeast LA, and every single person we touch, we're touching them for the lifetime of our organization. And we had been having conversations with neighbors, neighborhood council members, neighborhood watch members, community garden leaders, and they shared with us that neighbors were already checking in over the phone, having an informal phone tree. And from that, we developed something called the Northeast LA Community Response. And within 3 weeks, we capacity built over 150 dedicated volunteers, called our neighbors, identified needs, connected them to resources such as free food and delivery, or rent filing, or mortgage information, unemployment filing. And we were focused on reaching as many residents as we could in this short period of time with kind of weekly trainings on Zoom, which you saw on the previous slide. We also coupled that with a kind of language-less level of communication which we embedded using our kind of design skill to support this outreach effort. And we used bilingual and trilingual communication with everything we were doing. And as I mentioned, in just 3 weeks, we were able to kind of deliver, I think, food to over 200 families a week, craft kits for children who were staying at home and doing distance learning, and probably had parents who were working multiple jobs and not able to provide supervision. And we also developed this really robust volunteer system, which in many ways is really reflective of our abilities doing county and city project management. So we used a lot of those same expertise and capacity internally to develop this accessible program for volunteers and neighbors to provide support. And from there, we started kind of developing resource guides, information distribution, because the policy was changing weekly around rent and other things. And so here you can see what a kind of drop is. And we were also having to really explain some of these things around renters' rights in a way that was tangible, but also hand in hand with things around public health norms. And now we all have this like intuitive sense of what 6 feet is, but at the time it was very unclear what social distancing meant. On top of that, how to navigate any of the food systems or the available systems was opaque. And so we, again, kind of used these drops as a way to embed some kind of knowledge sharing to community members. And so we only ran the program, and the program was never going to be a long-term program, but we ran it for 10 weeks and we had all these really great outcomes. And in the end, looking at this kind of mutual aid project that we did when we shifted towards being place-based in a way, kind of from being a placemaking organization to a placekeeping organization, the outcome was that we learned how to build volunteer capacity. We learned how to kind of bolster existing models of resilience within the community, and how to do the thing that we were already doing. We were allocating resources on behalf of the council office, but instead on behalf of neighbors, for neighbors. And when looking at these previous areas of work and the amount of really insane levels of like capacity or like value that's quite invisible. And this is our backyard home section 8 and like all of the touch points that we were able to build over a 3-year period. And this is our public project, public realm project. And this is the permitting process, which was longer than the installation of the temporary project. Looking at those systems, I think they're all very lateral. It's just the who and who is centered that really shifted for us. So I think I'm just at time, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you, David, for for sharing the remarkable work. It's amazing to see both the projects, how they've evolved, how the strategies evolve, how you fine tune and find where you can be more effective. I mean, I think there's another project from LMS that is also very interesting about, how those projects guide policy changes from Futuro de Frogtown, where the process informed the local zoning code, or even like in David's work with the area. There was an article today on the Chicago Tribune about the idea of the lessons from the area, how they apply now to the Obama presidential center, and like the idea of pushing neighbors, and how do you create more agreements that would benefit the community. So it's like very interesting, how these efforts they solve or they address structural issues. So I have a couple of questions, but I'm just going to go with the chat because I think they are very interesting. So one of them is, Elizabeth, is for you. We'll start with you. How does LMAS work with the model of government that discourages open government volunteers and initiatives for a fairer and more formal, if antiquated and more time-consuming bidding process that tends to slow innovation and problem solving within communities?
It's interesting. I'm not sure if you all are familiar, you've heard about how the LA Times architecture critic became our chief design officer with the mayor's office, Christopher Hawthorne. He is trying to think about how bidding and how the process of getting projects is redone. And it's because there's no good way to do it that doesn't reinforce systems of inequality. Going through this kind of slower process to have people be able to participate in projects, it doesn't necessarily lead to the best people doing these projects, because you have a series of bureaucracy and hurdles that really prioritize individuals who have been at an advantage. And so it's very hard for community members or small design groups or anyone who's kind of outside of the formal system to be able to participate. And the city of Los Angeles often does workarounds with discretionary pots because of it, which is not fair either. So in this kind of bureaucratic context, I think that it's also really quite wonderful to be able to work outside of a system of needing any government funds. And this is something that I missed in saying in my presentation, but it is kind of a flawed pretext for all of us who are anti-racist, and all of us should be, that revising a system of inequality to prioritize some at the detriment of many is not a successful or logical pursuit. And that was really the seat at which we were at. So I would say that any of these kind of investments and facilitations with local government anyone should be very circumspect about them.
Great. David, there's a question for you. I've been very concerned in gentrification in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood, which I think it is more about displacement than demolition. David, can you speak about the changes in property ownership over the past decades, specifically the role of private equity versus traditional real estate owners, and how this is impacting places in Chicago like Pilsen and the South Side? I think the role of private equity is quite invisible to most people.
Sure. I think one of the, I mean, it's a big question, but one of the major ways that we've seen real estate investment shift in the last few decades, and really in the last 20 years, has been the rise of private equity in relationship to large-scale investments, and so as well as increasingly small-scale investments. And so we can think about neighborhoods like Pilsen, but also whole cities like Detroit, where private equity investors, so these are people who are sort of pooling money in order to invest, to make particular kinds of investments in largely in cities, that they're finding ways to fund projects that are going to change what's happening on the ground, right? And because they're able to pool money on a national or even international level, what they're able to do is bring so much more to the scenario that kind of outmatches anything that's going on locally. And so one of the things that we see is that these large private equity firms are able to come in and buy up large chunks of neighborhoods to create massive new projects, or in the case of Detroit, to go through and buy up, sometimes literally hundreds of homes throughout the city, all at once. And so this development has really changed the way that the displacement process works, about who controls what in cities, and sort of further moves towards a kind of concentration of thinking about real estate as something that is all about exchange and profit, rather than about where people live and what they get out of the place where they are.
Great. David, maybe you can talk a little bit, there's another question about your work in relationship to maybe the work of Amanda Williams and Tonika Johnson, and it's like how you might have collaborated with them. There's an overlap in some of the interests. Maybe if you can speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with their work, Amanda Williams and Tonika Johnson are both amazing artists working out of Chicago. I've do direct work with both of them. And in fact, so Amanda and I had a piece that we shared together, a collaboration in an exhibition at the Edelman Gallery over the summer that brought together one of her interventions as part of the Color Theory series, along with the Isolated Building series, a studies project. And so it was an opportunity to focus on one particular place over time. It's a place where I happen to have been photographing, and she made an intervention, and we brought the two pieces together to create a new time sequence piece that's looking at the way that divestment manifests in communities in the South Side of Chicago. And in particular, this place is actually in the site of where, or across the street, and part of the broader set of properties that are part of the Sweetwater Foundation's work right at the edge of Englewood and Washington Park. And Tonika Johnson's Folded Map project is something that was brought into direct dialogue. So she's presented on a number of panels with the film, and her talking about her work about Folded Map, which connects people in Englewood with people and other neighborhoods in the city, literally folding sort of the map of, or I suppose metaphorically folding the map of Chicago, getting people who might be on the, let's say, 6,000 block of such and such a street south, connecting with the people in the 6,000 block of such and such a street on the north. Just totally amazing work, and really pleased to be in dialogue with both of them, both making work together and also finding ways to stoke these conversations and give focus to it. So please, take a look at their work, Tonika Johnson and Amanda Williams.
Great. I have a question for both of you to kind of like maybe like concentrate more on the idea of the long term and the strategies. Like you've both talked about how you've adjusted throughout the projects, both in the area that you were concentrating, but also like maybe the tools that you use to do that. So you know, from LMS to the idea you have specific interventions, but you're also helping the neighbors like and the businesses to do loan things, bring together conversations, like you've led like co-visioning programs. So the outcome, once you understand the issue, has changed a lot. And with you, David, you also talk about the idea of the projects that you start maybe as a photographic project, and then at some point it might even turn into the film. So I'm curious to know more about those changes, how you evaluate those changes, what it implies as an organization or as an artist to do that. How does it change your mindset, and also how do you evolve with the skills that are required to do that? It's not the same thing to design something as to bring together people, or like to photograph empty spaces versus telling the story of Deborah and a community. I mean, those are very different skills. So I'm curious how you both approach those changes to make sure that those long-term initiatives are actually, they continue to be relevant.
I think something that we are having a lot of conversations about, which is the kind of based on the classic spectrum of engagement, and the kind of highest tier of engagement, which is community ownership and leadership. And it's that there's a kind of embedded process, and this is us obviously not as an individual, but an organization, discussing the idea that the kind of methodology should be coming from a internal voice. And we've always, as executive directors, felt that our organization should reflect the community that we're working in, or our community. And so a lot of the kind of tools and methods, I think, they sound sexy, right? Or they don't sound sexy. Like, we call people, right? We call people, we get on the phone, we call people, because Facebook and Instagram and flyers or mailers, or doing kind of GIS-based surveys, and then doing targeted approaches and outreach, all of that's fine. But calling people means that we're talking to the resident who's the least connected. And then we're understanding kind of like deep, prevalent systemic lack of access to certain things. And, or, you know, again, going back to the kind of phone tree, it's a more resilient model that doesn't rely on different tools and methods and technologies. So we've always, as an organization, been kind of like lo-fi and hi-fi about these things, where we're kind of going back and forth between tools and technologies, but also just real kind of like grassroots outreach. And having, you know, I think we have many times, as like a cute placemaking group, had people ask us how we do outreach. And it's super simple stuff, like pre-COVID going to a coffee shop rather than a school, or being like really intentional about having the conversation in the context of where you're doing something, right? And that the kind of white supremacy and tenets of that is that you talk about something abstractly, like removed from it. And that you kind of create multiple levels of removals and barriers between the conversation and the actual context to which you're speaking. And so it's trying to remove that by also having our organization reflect the community in which we're working, which is obviously a conundrum for me, being a white individual and like being at the center of this conversation without centering myself. And so it's a very complex, and David kind of referred to this as well, of being not an ally, but a like accomplice, with building in kind of redundant systems of communication that don't kind of prioritize any mean or method.
And I think to build on Elizabeth's point, I mean, I think that a lot of the work has been really about thinking about what are the lessons, and who are the lessons coming from, and trying to figure out how to reorganize the conversation in a way so it becomes about the work that's being done out in communities. And so, you know, the last part of the presentation today, we sort of providing all these examples of organizations that are doing that kind of work, because the idea is to be able to then send off into those other places to connect with people who are making the transition away from that sort of like study piece to the stepping back and sort of like thinking about the kind of work that people are actually actualizing. these kinds of action and trying to find a way to foreground that kind of work. And so, the typical way of doing a presentation for the area, for example, is then, it's Deborah and and me and someone from one of the community organizations with which we're in communication. It's about that kind of dynamic rather than about, it's not the film. So you think about the example of the Tribune article, the film becomes a launching point for a conversation where the alderman is now talking about what's going on in the community and how the policies that she wants to pursue will prevent something like this from happening in the future. And so trying to figure out how to, create that kind of that channel whenever possible.
Great. So we have a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to squeeze one last question for both of you. It starts with LA, but I think, David, your new book is probably going to help too. So in LA, there has been a discussion about reverting the Dodgers Stadium in the previous Chavez Ravine back to the promised affordable housing. Whether this demolishes the stadium or just the parking lot is up for discussion. But how do policy agitating organizations such as LA Mass and other active citizens advocate for truly anti-racist policies such as these? Like, does recent COVID testing in the Dodgers Stadium parking lot propose a public use future previously, for private spaces?
And it's now becoming a vaccine site, which is exciting. I think that if you look at Cincinnati, if you look at Detroit, if you look at so many cities, stadiums, and also our upcoming unfortunate hosting of the Olympics, it's incredibly destructive how we plan, how we've planned for these spectacles that are kind of usually placed in ways to kind of further undermine communities of color, and don't do much to kind of invest in a holistic, as David was doing a really great job of explaining, alternative way to kind of promote local economic models of resilience. And so I think LA Moss started because we realized that the wrong people were in the room talking about the wrong projects. And we were having people say yes or no to projects, and they were kind of at cross purposes. And so we have the Hollywood sign, we have the Silver Lake Reservoir, we have Dodger Stadium, all these sites that, or the LA River, that need to be reconsidered in a truly progressive way that is inclusive and holistic. And I think the future of Los Angeles, we're kind of grappling with what that looks like and who has the right to define it. So I think it's a great question. And I think it would be, and it starts with us saying this happened, just saying, we recognize that Northeast LA, many of their grandmothers and great grandfathers were displaced from Chavez Ravine, and acknowledging these acts of trauma. And trying to move forward in the middle.
And I guess I would just jump in to say that, in Chicago, there are all sorts of amazing community groups that are doing, strong sort of a reimagining of the relationship between, between policymaking and community. And so whether it be groups that are doing sort of anti-environmental racism work, both on the East Side and in Pilsen, organizations that are doing work around imagining a different kind of future for the Obama Presidential Center in Woodlawn, that these are organizations that are really thinking about what is the way to produce a truly anti-racist city, to produce a new vision, a different vision of the city that is founded in community principles. And so I think, those are just great places to start. But there are so many amazing examples of people who are doing that work today.
Well, we're at 6, so we're just reaching the time for the event. But I really want to thank you, Elizabeth and David, both for being part of today's event and sharing your work, but also for the remarkable, the amazing work that you're doing, all these like long-term commitments, and the way you're bringing up very important conversations through your work, and how that is putting at the forefront issues that sometimes they remain invisible, and how do you become accomplices to communities, how you're part of them. And so really thanking both of you for that work, and can't wait to see more than for everybody who has been attended the event. Thanks for being involved. I can see in the chat that there's going to be another event coming up. There's going to be more about the available cities, so stay tuned. But thanks so much to everybody.
Thank you so much.